Thank you, Shayna. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, all the volunteers who made this evening possible, and everyone at Briarpatch Magazine. I'm thrilled to finally be here, and I think that that Briarpatch deserves another round of applause for filling this very, very large room. Thank you. Although this is the first time I've given a speech with an evaluation form that follows. Bit nervous. You know, as Dave just said, I wrote the shock doctrine to expose this tactic that has been in play for many years now, for many decades by the right, which is to exploit moments of profound crisis, moments of shock, moments when we lose our bearings as a society. And it can happen after a natural disaster, it can happen in the wake of a war, but it can also happen in the midst of a profound economic crisis. To use that moment of fear, to step in, play the role of the all-powerful father figure, strong leader, say everything is under control as long as you give me special powers at this particular juncture, and then rapidly pass through what economists call economic shock therapy, transforming societies in those key moments. So as you can imagine, I've had a busy couple of days. It's been interesting because the shock doctrine came out exactly a year ago, and I've been very, very pleased with the reception, and it's been a real you know, in Canada, I received a lot of mainstream media attention, as you probably know. You were no doubt sick of me last September. But in the United States, obviously, it was a lot harder to get the book out there. But it was really championed by students and online. And this week, there's just been this sort of turnaround where suddenly I'm getting calls from like CNN and places like that going, so what is this shock doctrine thing again? So it has been eventful. So I want to lay out very briefly what I'm talking about in the book, and I want to take this opportunity. It's rare to have 800 people gathered in a room together, brought together by a variety of fantastic activists, journalists, organizers, researchers, and we shouldn't waste this opportunity. Because it's an important time. It's an important time to gather because of what's happening on the markets and also what's happening with the elections in this country. So I want to use this precious space well. Yeah, so I'll just very briefly outline the thesis of the book for those of you who don't know it. It is an alternative history of how we ended up with this market fundamentalist approach that sees no role for government except really facilitating corporate profits. So it isn't exactly an anti-interventionist model. It intervenes on behalf of capital when it is profitable, to pass free trade agreements, for instance, to aggressively protect intellectual property rights, but also to deregulate, to privatize, to serve the public sphere up to the private sector. But what we're seeing this week, of course, is a very different kind of government intervention, but also in keeping with those goals of extreme profitability. But I really object the analysis, to the analysis that we're seeing a departure somehow with this multi-billion-dollar rush to bail out Wall Street. I don't see this as a departure. I see this as wholly consistent, actually, with the way our governments have been serving the interests of capital. It's just that it's somewhat of a reversal in the directions, in the sense that what we've been steadily doing is serving up public wealth and public money to the private sector, and now we're taking the private debts. But it's consistent, is it not? The idea for this book came out of, well, it came out of a very specific experience that I had. I was in Argentina making a documentary film with my husband, Avi Lewis, which is called The Take. And, you know, it's interesting, I have to say, Argentina's been on my mind these past couple weeks. I keep hearing these economists on television going, I've never seen anything like this before, and I keep going, I have. I mean, I saw the run on the banks in Argentina. I saw HSBC and Citibank and Barclays having to shutter themselves with steel because they were being attacked by the people who had trusted them with their savings and lost their savings. And I was on BBC the other day on Newsnight, which is their flagship evening news program, and I was talking to the producer before the show, and I said, you know, people keep saying they've never seen anything like this, but I've seen it in Argentina. And he goes, well, things are bad enough. Can you not say that on our show? So I didn't, but I'm telling you, I've seen it. And in fact, you know, in the take, we start the film saying that we see Argentina as a warning, you know? And there was this chant in the streets before, but it was January 2002. The World Economic Forum, the WEF, that usually meets every year in Davos, Switzerland, the sort of meeting of the great elites, right, where they sort of plot out the deregulation of the world economy. In 2002, in January 2002, shortly after the September 11th attacks, they decided to have their annual meeting in New York to support the economy of New York. And the context in which this happened was not just the September 11th attacks. It was also the implosion of Enron and also the implosion of Argentina's economy in December 2001. Argentina, the model student of Washington that had followed all of the dictates, privatized everything, a truly hollowed out country. Everything was owned by foreign multinationals. And they had eliminated all capital controls, which meant that when their currency started diving, the banks just loaded up cash onto American money at the time, worth something, into armored trucks, then onto planes, and just flew it out of the country, which is why they had to lock down the banks to prevent small savers from taking their money too. So there were protests in New York City. And by the way, there's going to be a protest on Wall Street on Thursday against the bailout. And one of the slogans is, after the shock, no shock therapy, which I'm very pleased about. And the chant in the streets in New York that week, and some of you will remember this, it was, "You are Enron, we are Argentina." And I thought that was an amazing chant. And it has proved incredibly prescient, of course, because so much of the financial sector has revealed itself as an Enron-style shell game. And so much of the global economy is ending up, or so many people are ending up in the state that Argentinians ended up in at that point, locked out of their own wealth. So I was in Argentina at this moment, actually, of popular revolt. We weren't making a film about the economic crisis. We were making a film about what happened after the economic crisis. Because the chant in the streets in Argentina at that point was "Que se vayan todos," which means everyone must go. And it was directed at government, it was directed at bankers, it was directed at economists, it was directed at all the so-called experts who had landed them in this mess. And Argentinians threw out 5 presidents in a span of 3 weeks, because what they were trying to do was actually get rid of the system itself. It's just very hard to do. I mean, it's easy to get rid of one politician and replace them with another and another and another, but it's much harder to go after what in Argentina they called el modelo, which means the model, which means privatization, deregulation, cuts to government spending, neoliberalism. But after throwing out all of these politicians, there was this wave of grassroots direct action. We ended up making a film about workers who refused to be fired. And I raise this because I actually think this is a moment when we need to think about these sorts of more radical tactics. And factories were closing en masse, and workers were seeing what happens when you get laid off. Half the country had slipped under the poverty line. And so at around 200 factories, people just decided not to be fired. They unfired themselves. And they staged the reverse of a strike. You know, if we think about a traditional strike as being the withholding of labor, what these workers did was they just simply refused to stop working. So they said to their bosses, if you want to leave, leave, but we're keeping the machines, we know how to work them, and we're going to run this workplace democratically. So we documented that process. And it was while we were living in Argentina that the war in Iraq began. And it was really kind of amazing to be, not just in Argentina, but in Latin America at this moment, where this economic model was in profound crisis. Everywhere, Venezuela, Brazil, which had just elected Lula. Was just this huge referendum in Uruguay where they had voted overwhelmingly against privatization of the phone system and water, and eventually they would elect a left-wing government running on an anti-neoliberal campaign. This is before Morales was elected in Bolivia, but there were huge protests going on, throwing out Bechtel, standing up to the gas companies. So Latin America was a continent in revolt against these policies. And the seeds of the alternatives were beginning to sprout. Then you have this attack on Iraq, shock and awe. And then while the city of Baghdad is still burning, Paul Bremer shows up. And I remember vividly reading about this in the Buenos Aires newspapers, looking at this guy and these pictures of him in a business suit and army boots, which I now describe as the uniform of the disaster capitalist. And he declares Iraq open for business. And then, before there is any Iraqi government whatsoever, while it's under complete military occupation by the United States, Paul Bremer passes a kind of tsunami of laws that turns Iraq into a textbook case of Milton Friedman-style free markets. Like the wish lists of the Republican Party. So it isn't just that foreign companies can own 100% of Iraqi assets. It isn't just that they're going to privatize all of Iraq's state-owned companies, though they're doing all that too. They also pass through like these weird pet policies, like a 15% flat tax, and they want to privatize the health system, the education system, and so on. Now, we know that this didn't work, that it backfired, but this was the strategy. We often hear there wasn't a plan, a post-war plan in Iraq. That was the problem. And what I've been arguing, since I went to Iraq for Harper's Magazine and wrote about this, was that there was a plan. It was just a really, really dumb, stupid, bad plan. But the plan was there, and it was aggressively implemented, okay? The plan was to use the shock of the invasion to, and actually I quote in the book Richard Armitage, who was the Undersecretary of State at the time. And he said that the plan was that Iraqis would be so shocked and so awed that they would be easily marshaled from point A to point B, i.e., the shock of the war would create the context for this radical sort of extreme country makeover, just blank the slate, start over, build this corporate utopia, right? And actually, Richard Armitage said, well, the problem is that Iraqis don't appear to have been sufficiently shocked or awed. He compared them unfavorably to the Japanese after World War II. That was the plan, and the plan backfired, needless to say. Now, I ended up writing a book about it as opposed to just a series of articles because I started to see this pattern repeating. And where it comes in with relation to Latin America is what it seemed to me at the time that this incredibly heavy-handed, unbelievably anti-democratic way of transforming countries must in part be happening because it was no longer possible to impose these policies on the so-called developing world with any veneer of consent, right? I mean, Latin America had been the first part of the world, the first laboratory for these policies. Chile under Augusto Pinochet with the Chicago Boys. And it was rejecting neoliberalism. The World Trade Organization talks were stalled. Countries increasingly don't want to negotiate with the International Monetary Fund. So all of these sort of semi-peaceful ways of imposing these policies as conditions to a loan, as the price of admission to the World Trade Organization, those weren't working anymore. People were onto it. And of course, the so-called anti-globalization movement was the most visible manifestation of that global rejection of these policies. So suddenly, it was, don't even bother asking, just bomb countries and impose these policies in the aftermath of war. That's what I mean by disaster capitalism. And by the way, if it doesn't work out, it still works out because the war itself is privatized. So the worse things get in Iraq, the more you do have an economic boom, but it's not, McDonald's in downtown Baghdad, it's Blackwater and Halliburton, and the fact that private contractors now outnumber U.S. soldiers, foreign soldiers in Iraq. There are 180,000 contractors in Iraq and 150,000 soldiers. Now, when the war began, there was one contractor for every 10 soldiers. So that means that the worse things get, the more of an economic boom this becomes for this sort of parallel private military structure. But this goes beyond Iraq, and this, what I'm calling disaster capitalism, we've now seen in many other disaster zones. I'm going to talk a little bit about New Orleans just because I think it's really relevant to what's going on right now in the United States. And also just because I think people don't talk about New Orleans enough. It's kind of shockingly absent from the U.S. presidential elections. I find it shocking because it's such a stunning example of the failures of all of these policies and also, of course, the challenge of climate change. So now New Orleans, as I think you all know, this was not a natural disaster. New Orleans wasn't hit by a Category 5 hurricane. Katrina was a Category 5 hurricane, and that is connected to global warming, even though people don't like to talk about it too much. But yes, there are, it's not your imagination, many more increasingly intense storms in the Gulf of Mexico because the temperature is rising in the Gulf of Mexico. And rising temperatures is directly connected to the intensity of storms in the Gulf. So, we don't know, we can't tie any one individual storm to global warming, but we can tie this broader trend to global warming, and this was certainly part of that trend. But by the time Katrina hit New Orleans, it had been downgraded to a tropical storm. It wasn't actually a Category 5 hurricane anymore. The reason the levees broke was because the public infrastructure had been allowed to decay. So what created the real disaster was the intersection, and I think we're going to see this more and more, between heavy weather and weak, crumbling public infrastructure. Not just the levees, but the public transit system. A government that couldn't find the city, seemingly, because everyone was on vacation. It did seem that America was some kind of a failed state at every level. That was the real disaster. And there was this moment, and I'm sure many of you remember it, when looking at this, it seemed that it was going to lead to, and this is a reason why I think we need to pay attention to it, because I think we're in a similar moment right now. There was this feeling that, of course, this would lead to a fundamental questioning of the ideology that had created this disaster in the first place. This was assumed by progressives because the evidence was so overwhelming. Well, that's not true. That's not what happened. What actually happened was there was an instant recognition by the right in the United States that they had an opportunity on their hands. And I was in New Orleans during the flood, and I spent some time in Baton Rouge, which is the Louisiana state capital, and I interviewed all kinds of lobbyists and and government officials, and everybody was talking about, they kept using this phrase, clean sheet, blank slate. Richard Baker, a Republican congressman, said, we couldn't clean out the housing projects, but God did. And the developers in New Orleans had wanted those housing projects for a long time, because in New Orleans, unlike in many American cities, the housing projects, the public housing projects, are right downtown on very desirable pieces of real estate. And this is the legacy of the New Deal, of the fight for decent housing in the United States. And actually, these 5,000 units of public housing sustained minimal damage precisely because they were so well built, because they were so sturdy, and many of them were on higher ground. So there was no need to demolish them. But they have been demolished. All of them have been demolished. And this is what I mean by the shock doctrine, using a shock to push through policies that you couldn't push through otherwise. But that phrase, it's a reminder that this is a very old process. This phrase from that Republican congressman, we couldn't clean out the housing projects, but God did. Because it's a reminder that this mistaking of disasters with God's will, this confusion between great tragedy and a clean sheet, it really goes back to the founding of our countries, of the United States and Canada. And in the writings, in the diaries of the Pilgrims who settled North America, parts of North America, they, as we know, the great killer in that period was not guns, it was disease, in particular smallpox. And there was this constant, in the writings of the Pilgrims, this constant evoking of God's will. And this discussion of of smallpox, as it was often called the divine plague, because it wiped out indigenous people and cleared the land to be taken over. So that was the original home invasion, and so it repeats. Disaster capitalism is an old concept, and our countries are founded on it. So when I was in New Orleans, there was a meeting going on. I didn't know it at the time. I found out about it later. I got the minutes. They're on my website. There was a meeting that went on 2 weeks after the levees broke in Washington at a right-wing think tank called the Heritage Foundation. And there were representatives of all the big right-wing think tanks, but also something called the Republican Study Committee, which is the top Republican lawmakers in Washington. And remember, the city is still partially flooded. And they come up with a list. The heading is Free Market Solutions for Hurricane Katrina and High Oil Prices. And there's 32 of these ideas, okay? The first one is suspend labor regulations that requires paying the living wage, something called Davis-Bacon for contractors. They did do that. Don't rebuild the public school system. Give parents vouchers so they can have school choice, right? Don't rebuild the public housing projects. Have mixed-use housing. And on and on and on. There were a couple other things. Open up offshore oil drilling and drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I start the book with a quote from Milton Friedman. He says, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the change depends on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to keep the ideas ready until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. Okay? So the people at the Heritage Foundation saw Katrina as that opportunity, and they got a lot of it done, a lot of it, which is why I really object to this discussion of the Bush administration as incompetent. When I go to New Orleans today, I see competence. I see mission accomplished, okay? Not all of it, though. They didn't actually get the offshore oil drilling or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And it's interesting because there was a whole other strategy when oil reached $130 a barrel. Newt Gingrich has a group, America Solutions for Something Tomorrow, and they waited until that shock hit, and then commissioned all these opinion polls and petitions and things like that, and managed to get McCain to endorse offshore oil drilling within 2 weeks. And it's really incredible how quickly this happened, because even if you think back to the Republican primaries, they weren't even talking about offshore oil drilling. It wasn't one of the issues at all. They put this on the agenda since May, right? Sarah Palin was chosen as VP almost exclusively based on her credentials as a driller, okay? Her main contribution, the sum total of her national profile was going on a few chat shows in the United States and saying, we drill here, drill now. We can get off foreign oil. By the way, they don't know about the tar sands in the United States. They think all their oil is coming from Saudi Arabia. No one has told them about Alberta or Saskatchewan. And we can tell them a little bit about energy security when you're doing your domestic drilling, because we can't turn off the tap. So So there was a very clear strategy there, but what's important to understand is that the ideas were lying around, and they're still lying around. And bit by bit, many of these goals are being accomplished. All right, so let's talk about what just happened this past week. Now, the crisis on Wall Street, I think people pretty much seem to agree that it was born of deregulation, born of over-leveraged financial houses, and also the intermixing of different kinds of financial functions, like investment banking, savings banks, insurance companies. So all of these mergers were allowed to happen, and this is deregulation in action, because it used to be illegal, and this is a post-depression victory, a post-market crash victory. It used to be illegal for, if you wanted to gamble, if you wanted to be engaged in casino capitalism, you had to use your own investors' money, and that's it. If you wanted to be a bank and accept the savings of customers, then you couldn't be a gambler. So there was a firewall put up in 1934 between investment banks and consumer banks, and that wall was taken down in the 80s and 90s, and that's why you have now, today, Henry Paulson testifying and saying, we have to do this because the savings of Americans are on the line. We're not bailing out Wall Street, we're bailing out you, right? But this mania for deregulation, which was really about creating the conditions for the maximum profitability for Wall Street, is precisely what put so many people at risk. So none of this had to happen. All of this was entirely avoidable. In fact, clear measures were put in place precisely to avoid this after the Great Depression, but they got in the way of obscene profits. I mean, that is literally what we're dealing with here. And what's even more obscene is that we're hearing more and more that the real problem are all those poor people who, bought houses they can't afford. The real problem is that Wall Street handed out $39 billion in bonuses last year. 5 firms, the same 5 firms that have failed, okay, for a job well done. What's the job well done? Very, very high short-term returns. That's what they rewarded themselves for, the same thing that they are now failing over and going to taxpayers for a bailout. So this is the reason why I've been getting calls this week, because, of course, this bailout is an incredible handout for big business, but also it's an amazing concentration of power. And the reason why I concentrate on crisis and shocks and these strategies of using the window of opportunity that opens up when people are frightened, when people are afraid, to ram through policies and not debate them, is because it puts the lie to the central claim of the right, which is that free markets and free people go hand in hand. This is deeply anti-democratic, to push through decisions when people are either shattered by war, scattered throughout the United States because they've lost their homes, or so worried about their future that they're willing to believe anything. This is a deeply anti-democratic impulse. So the problem is not responding to a crisis with clear ideas. That's not the problem. The problem is trying to use crisis to circumvent democracy, okay? So enter Henry Paulson. Now, Henry Paulson, I mean, what's been interesting about this moment is that one of the clearest examples, and I'm sure it's been on your mind as I've been talking, of this shock doctrine strategy is, of course, the way in which the shock of September 11th was so expertly seized upon and manipulated by political leaders in the United States and also in Canada to push through policies that would have been totally unacceptable under other circumstances, and what has led to atrocities like what happened to Maharara, but also to the opening of Guantanamo, the pushing through of the Patriot Act, and of course, the building up of an entirely false case for war in Iraq. So people have been talking about this bailout plan, the $700 billion bailout plan, as a kind of economic Patriot Act, having it ready to go for the crisis, and saying, basically putting, a gun to the head of Congress, saying, pass it or we'll all die, right? I mean, it is not a bailout, it is a stick-up. It is an incredible document, and it's super short. I brought it here. It's only 3 pages long. apparently, I just read an article in Time today where they say actually that Paulson has been working on this for 3 months. I don't know why it took him 3 months to write this document. The New York Times said, it's stunning in its simplicity, but, I actually think it's too complicated. I could have written this in 1 paragraph. I'm a former editor, as you heard. It would just be Henry Paulson can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and you're never allowed to ask any questions. This is my favorite clause, okay? This is not a joke. This is my favorite clause. Decisions by the Secretary, pursuant to the authority of this Act, are non-reviewable and committed to agency discretion and may not be reviewed by any court of law or any administrative agency. Yeah. It's a coup. It's an economic coup. And thank goodness, actually, that there really is some pushback going on. And it's happening not because the Democrats have any backbone, but because there's an election going on. And their first impulse, which was rubber stamp, maybe tack on a couple of lines about those homeowners. But yeah, let's bail them out. Let's take their bad debts. Let's pay lots of money for things that they should be paying you to take, right? Let's overpay. It's actually that the American people are so fed up with this, see through it so clearly, that it's forcing the Democrats in the middle of an election campaign to get much, much tougher. I mean, it's been really interesting just watching sort of the word on the street kind of interviews. What do you think of this? People hate it across political lines. So that's heartening. So obviously this is an example of the anti-democratic impulse, as well as the just, rampant hypocrisy of these high-risk capitalists. One of the things that's interesting, obviously, about Paulson, and I'm sure, some of you have followed this, he's playing the sort of Rudy Giuliani role of this crisis, right? He's daddy. And he's going to take care of us. And there's this sort of bipartisan thing of, at least there's the right strong man in the job, and he's like this big football player guy, and he seems really strong, and that makes people somehow feel relaxed. But, Henry Paulson, okay, this is his resume. Nixon administration, Goldman Sachs, 32 years at Goldman Sachs, Bush administration. Okay? It's actually very simple. It's stunning in its simplicity, actually. He was CEO of Goldman Sachs. He worked his way up. And he was known as Mr. Risk, because he was the guy, as CEO of Goldman Sachs, to embrace these very, very high-risk, complex, hybrid, high-return, house of cards debt mechanisms. In fact, there was this sort of laudatory piece in Business Week when he was first appointed Treasury, the headline, Treasury Secretary. The headline was, "Mr. Risk goes to Washington." And they were saying, this is great because the American economy is in trouble. Henry Paulson understands risk. The American economy needs to take risks. And how great is it that when Henry Paulson took over as CEO of Goldman Sachs in 1999, they had $20 billion in debt, and when he left in 2005, they had $100 billion in debt. In other words, Henry Paulson is bailing out his own debts, okay? That's how corrupt this really is. Dick Cheney, Halliburton levels of corrupt. This is why, it really is consistent. And not some radical departure. In the book I use the phrase corporatism to describe what is the kind of government that we actually have. This trading of favors between political parties and large corporate players. And we're certainly not immune here in Canada. And that's just becoming more and more naked, actually. So now I think what's important to understand is that this is not over. If they do get this bailout through in some form, it's essentially not in any way solving a crisis. First of all, there's way more debt than they're talking about buying, so the market could still be in trouble. But more importantly, they're taking a crisis that is on Wall Street and they're moving it to Washington, right? Where it will then explode as a debt crisis or deficit crisis. Now, what that means is that whoever the next president is takes power in the midst of an economic crisis, and then they will say, well, we have no choice. Now, if it's McCain, he's already said he wants to privatize Social Security, which is a way to give Wall Street another bubble, a few more $100 billion to play with. And the emergency being created right now becomes the justification for the total dismantling of the public sphere. Okay? Now, the reason I talked about New Orleans is because New Orleans, what has happened in New Orleans is so counterintuitive, right? You have a disaster that was born of climate change and the neglect of the public sphere, and the solution, apparently, is more oil drilling and erasing the public sphere entirely. Now, that has happened in New Orleans. The public housing projects have been demolished. The only public hospital in New Orleans that treated people without health insurance is still closed. The education system in New Orleans has been turned into the leading laboratory for the charter and the voucher model. So they have finished the job, and people don't understand this. And what I think they're talking about now is doing that for the entire country. And I say this because they say it. You know, the people who came up with that list, the Republican Study Committee, they just issued a list today about what they think the way to solve the crisis is in the United States. And it's, they want to completely eliminate the capital gains tax. They want to eliminate corporate taxation. They want to privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, break them up and privatize them. They want to eliminate the regulations that were passed after Enron collapsed. So in other words, more and more and more of the same. And, you know, I just feel quite frantic about this because I think it's so counterintuitive that people think, oh, they'll never get away with it. But the reason they get away with it is because they are ready with their ideas, they're totally unhesitating, and they push them through in these moments of crisis. So the bomb has yet to drop. Now, we are hearing that from Stephen Harper that Canada is okay. That we are immune. And of course, Saskatchewan is, you know, in the midst of an economic boom. And you certainly know all about price shocks here. I think we need to be extremely wary of where a Harper government, a new Harper government, whether it's a minority or, heaven forbid, a majority, where they would fit in as this crisis inevitably spreads to Canada. Because, of course, the legacy of these free trade policies in Canada, of neoliberalism in Canada, means that we are ever more vulnerable to all of these shocks, precisely because we're so trade dependent, precisely because we're becoming more and more dependent on resources that are subject to price shocks and extreme market volatility. I don't need to tell you that. So the situation we have here in Canada, Harper. Now, he comes out of the think tanks, right? He comes out of these very ideological think tanks that so expertly used economic crisis in the past in Canada to push through so many of the worst reforms that we're still dealing with. I shouldn't use the word reforms because that makes it sound good. But of course, we have some experience here in Canada of how a largely manufactured economic crisis gets used in the aftermath of an election to push through policies that Canadians never wanted. Now, all we need to think about to remember this is the 1993 election. The Liberals run on a campaign of jobs, jobs, jobs. They're going to reopen NAFTA and put in labor and environmental standards. Actually, their campaign is very similar to the campaign Obama is running right now. They win in a landslide, the Tories are demolished, and as soon as they take office, all the right-wing media and all of the think tanks and Stephen Harper playing a leading role whip up hysteria about the deficit, about the debt bomb, as it was called, which actually had nothing to do with spending on social programs and everything to do with monetary policy and the fact that interest rates had just been increased, which had massively expanded the size of the debt as it had, you know, in many parts of the world. So this was not a crisis born of the fact that Canadians dared to have health care or public education or unemployment insurance or welfare. It was a problem created by bad monetary policy, but seized upon and amplified. And a weak Liberal government caved in very, very quickly. And this, of course, process culminated with Paul Martin's 1995 budget, which dramatically cut transfer payments. Our healthcare system is only just barely recovering from those cuts now. And, of course, unemployment insurance was gutted, and so on. So we know who Stephen Harper is. We know this strategy. We've lived through it. We see the precariousness of the world markets and what's going on in the United States. This is a potential shock doctrine moment in Canada. Now, Stephen Harper knows, as we all know, that he can't win an election in Canada unless he promises to protect public health care, to protect the CBC. But a state of emergency immediately after he takes office can easily be used, even if it's a minority, to say, I'm sorry, we'd love to, but we have to be fiscally responsible. So I think we need to really take aim at this idea of strong leadership. Because, of course, this, in the same way that, the strong leaders, we can see it more clearly in the U.S. because it's a little more caricatured, the way in which the Bush and Giuliani's and now Paulson's, use moments of crisis to say, I'll be the father figure. But that is essentially Stephen Harper's entire campaign. Who do you want at the helm? Who do you trust? Who will be your daddy? That is the campaign. A Tory victory is not inevitable. We really have to shake this off because that's what they have going for them more than anything else, is this feeling that it's inevitable and we just throw up our hands. There could be a coalition. It's looking more and more possible that the NDP might actually be open to working with the Liberals, maybe even the Greens. So a coalition is possible, which would actually keep out a Tory government, and that has to be the goal, because Stephen Harper may be a strong leader, but he is a strong leader who would weaken everything that we care about in this country, and we need to get that message out. Now, I want to have time for questions, so I was going to talk a little bit more about the 30s and the 40s and the context in which progressive victories have been won in this country and around the world. You know that in Saskatchewan better than most places. One of the things that's so interesting about studying the way in which the right has won these past 35 years and this strategy of deliberately readying for crisis, keeping the ideas ready in the think tanks for whenever the crisis hits, whatever it is that it is actually a strategy that is born of studying the left. Not studying the left as exploiters of crisis, but understanding that particularly market crises are extraordinarily volatile moments, and actually are more naturally progressive moments than they are right-wing moments, which is why the right needs such an aggressive strategy to make sure that that natural inclination to put laissez-faire capitalism on trial when it indicts itself so spectacularly has to be resisted, right? The entire right-wing counter-revolution of the past 35 years has been an attempt to dismantle the gains that were made by working people, by families, by students, by consumer groups in the 1930s and 40s in response to economic crisis. This has been a great undoing. The housing projects, the New Deal housing projects, the post-market crash market regulations that were undone. This has been the period of undoing those progressive victories. But it is also a reminder that these moments of crisis, these moments of volatility, are actually ours to lose, right? If we have the courage. And all of the crises that we're facing, not just the market crises, but the food crisis, the global food crisis, which of course is intimately connected to those soaring commodity prices, which is part of why Saskatchewan's economy is doing so well, which kind of makes all of us disaster capitalists, I suppose. The food crisis, the energy crisis, all of these are warnings. They're telling us that the system isn't healthy, that it isn't working. Now, what we're hearing from the right is more of the same. Solve the food crisis with genetically modified foods. Solve the climate crisis, turn the climate crisis into an energy crisis and solve it with more drilling and more tar sand development. It's a suicide mission, right? And people are seeing it. They're seeing through it more and more. So I think it's a really great time to learn our progressive history. And of course, so much of Canada's progressive history is rooted in this province. And you know, I say this because one of the things about shock, about states of shock, is that this whole political strategy is really a war that's waged on memory. You know, if we think about what shock really means, it doesn't just mean a bad thing happening. It means a bad thing happening that you don't understand. A state of shock is a gap that opens up between an event and narrative, event and analysis, our ability to understand that event, right? So the way we orient ourselves, the way we stay out of shock, is actually by knowing our own history, knowing where we are in time and space. That's how we can weather bad things happening, but still stay alert, not regress, not look for father figures, not panic, right? And you know, this is the thing that we do know somewhere inside of us about crisis, is that they test us. Crises test us. And I think we all know from personal and collective crises and shocks that you know, we kind of go one or two ways. They are moments of extreme reaction. And one of those extreme reactions is the one that I've been talking about tonight that is so dangerous, which is regression, which is just falling apart and looking for those leaders to save us. But we also have seen and felt the opposite, which is the rising to the occasion, right? The finding reserves of strength and adulthood that we maybe didn't know exist. So we really have this choice in any crisis of either to regress or grow up. And it's time to grow the hell up. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. I just have to tell you quickly, when RPIRG, Regina Public Interest Research Group, when I found out that we were going to be sponsoring you coming today, I proceeded to spend the entire afternoon watching YouTube videos of you, and it's even better in person. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of Regina, the university and RPIRG, and the other sponsors as well, for coming here today and sharing with us your capacity for linking theory and action. We at RPIRG share in your desire to unite education and action. As a token of appreciation, we would like to offer you a year subscription to Briarpatch. Of course. And this sweetgrass smudge pouch to thank you for coming, but also for all the important work that you do.
Thank you.
We can now take this opportunity to ask Naomi a few questions. In the interest of time and of allowing as many people to ask questions as possible, and I would really like to stress this, we ask that people keep their comments at the microphone to a maximum of 3 sentences, no exceptions. And one of those sentences must end with a question mark. So go ahead.
Hi, Naomi. Thanks for this. I'm Shadia Drury at the university here in Regina, and I'm wondering what you think of the idea that maybe the American government should buy shares in these companies that it's bailing out so that they can have ownership. Because what is happening now is that just to give a blank check to Wall Street is a very, very bad idea. So, and have nothing in return. And people are saying, this isn't socialism. This isn't a reversal. Socialism is all about taking from the rich and giving to the poor.
Okay. No, that's a great question. I think it's better than what they're talking about doing, which is just taking the bad debts, just taking the junk, and putting it in a hole that you're not allowed to ask any questions about, which seems like a weird way to handle a crisis born of lack of transparency and regulation. But I also don't think it's the solution. In part because it's so very hard to tell the difference between the Bush administration and these companies. You know, I don't think that there would be any guarantee that they would run these companies any differently if they own shares in them, because they have nationalized essentially Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they've also taken over AIG. They have 80% of the shares of AIG in return for their $85 billion bailout. But all they did was change the CEOs. They haven't even said to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you can't foreclose. Now that Americans own these mortgage companies, they haven't said you can't foreclose on the 2 million Americans facing foreclosure. So they're not making any real profound changes that is connected to the equity. So when honestly, I think there's a really fantastic piece by William Grider, who's a really great economic writer for The Nation, a colleague of mine, and it's up on the Nation website. And basically what Grider is saying, and I completely agree, is that the financial sector has failed. It has completely failed. And it's not a question of just getting equity in these companies. They have to take control over the financial sector. They need to do massive trust busting, break up these companies, completely restructure them, put up those firewalls that were taken down. And you know, just getting a few shares is not going to solve the problem, especially when the person we're talking about is Henry Paulson. So it's just like, okay, he ran it in the private sector, now he runs it in the public sector. He's going to run it the same way. Right? So I think we need to have a vision for actually how you fix it, not just getting a piece of it.
Thank you.
In listening to your talk, my metaphor comes as a shark bite. And from the first bite, which is the shock, you have that much time before the second bite. But that can be two sentences. I was curious about the idea that people who are basically sociopaths and lacking an understanding of that sociopathy has been some of the problem with our inactions, I think. If we recognized them as a predator chasing us, we would probably respond differently. There's a thing called HARP. Question! There's a thing called HARP. It's land-based Star Wars. It controls the emotions of people en masse, and it also increases the temperature of areas, and another function I can't remember right now. My question is, if you're aware of HARP, are things like that capable of creating a disaster to help them prepare for their shock and awe?
Okay. Thank you. I know a little bit about it, but not enough to comment. And this comes up, because I obviously I don't think these are good guys, and I mean I don't want to underestimate their malevolence. I think that's a mistake. But I also feel that the crises are coming fast and furious, and that we don't actually need sort of conspiracies to get the disasters to then exploit them. Because this is such a volatile system, climatically, economically, militarily. We have an economic model that is a crisis creation machine. You deregulate the financial sector, you will have shock after shock after shock. These kinds of market shocks, also price shocks. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. So you don't need to plan them so that you can exploit them. You actually just need to do nothing, and they will happen. This is one place where laissez-faire actually works. do nothing, the crises will keep coming, have this incredibly short-term vision of economic growth. You will continue to meet the so-called energy crisis by looking for more and more of the very substances that are at the heart of our real crisis, which is the climate crisis. You will have more resource wars. You will have more blowback from those resource wars. So I feel like the one thing we have plenty of right now is crises to exploit. So that's why I don't spend much time, thinking about what is being planned in back rooms and what's not. I think the opportunism is being planned in back rooms. I've got the minutes, they're online, and that's enough because this is, as I said, this is a suicide mission. It is demanding of us a fundamental rethinking of how we calculate growth. It's challenging the premise that growth should be our goal as a society, and I think we have our work cut out for us in that way.
Is it like slim pickings on the missile?
In 1913, there was a panic caused by a monetary crisis and a deflationary cycle, which led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. In 1930, we had the Great Depression, and that led to the creation of the New Deal. But both of those things got us off of a gold standard. Oil right now is worth the same price in gold as it was 70 years ago, but the American dollar is worth 4 cents compared to the dollar of 1913. And that was based on democratic, what you call progressive things forced through during two panics, two shocks. Sweden, which has one of the best economies in the world, was 80% government owned, and during their economic collapse in the 80s, they deregulated and now have one of the finest economies in the world, the #1 healthcare system in the world, which is partially privately owned, during, again, shocks. So my question for you is this. What are you talking about? It doesn't work. You can't claim that just because, well, they rammed through some things, so did your side. So what's the difference between the Federal Reserve and the New Deal, which devalued the dollar, and, say, Stephen Harper? How are those things different?
Well, look, the New Deal was born out of an incredible tension in the United States between a president who did not run on a radical platform and a population that was in revolt. And the difference between disaster capitalism and what I'm calling disaster populism is really that the people are involved in disaster populism. That's why it's populist, it's popular. And what brought the New Deal is not FDR being a nice guy and being in a back room and cooking it up. What brought the New Deal was incremental. They kept having to add things because the population was so radical that they were actually worried about revolution. And this was a compromise. And I'm not saying all parts of it were great, but I'm saying that the ways in which this happened in terms of democratic values were radically different. Progressives responded to the crisis of the market crash by putting laissez-faire economics on trial, by organizing general strikes, by taking direct action in the face of foreclosures, by demanding a different kind of society that was not as brutal as the one that had thrown people into so much poverty so suddenly in the market crash. So I see, I think I'm pretty clear. I'm clear in the book and I'm clear when I speak that these crises demand action. And we basically have a choice of whether we're going to respond in an authoritarian manner. And by the way, I say in the book that the far left absolutely has used authoritarian tactics in the midst of crisis, which is why Joseph Stiglitz calls his former colleagues at the World Bank and the IMF market Bolsheviks, okay? The far left has done this, but I don't think the response to the Great Depression is that. I think the response to the Great Depression was an example of populism, not an authoritarian impulse. And I think the right has rewritten history and presented this as a purely top-down process, when in fact it was, some of the greatest bottom-up populist movements in our history.
What about Sweden? Radical deregulation. Radical deregulation.
I can't comment on Sweden, I'm sorry. I'm not sure exactly I understand what the question is, because Sweden's a social democracy.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment quickly that we won't take any more questions after you guys because there's quite a lineup here. And just a reminder that 3 sentences is enough for a question.
And what I'll actually do is I'll take 4, and I'll take them all at once, just to get a few more.
Thank you.
Okay.
I heard this afternoon it's no longer a bailout, but a rescue. Whether it's doublespeak or Gingrich's language booklet or just straight out zombie lies, how do we fight the message management of the right?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have a simple question. It seems that there's a media blackout going on in Galveston, Texas, that other hurricane that nobody talks about. And is this kind of a reversal of trying to pretend that it's okay and it's not going to happen, or what's going on there?
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to ask a question about if you could maybe comment a little bit more on how this crisis, this current financial crisis in the United States, is different now in an open economy. The fact that we have, when the crash happened in 1929, a closed economy. Now we have an international economy. The US dollar is basically the international currency that people need to trade in. And when Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were bailed out, when they were nationalized, I think I read a report that a lot of the Asian countries were putting a lot of pressure on the US government because they had a lot invested. So the fact that we have so much, the international economy is so integrated now, and if you could maybe comment on how this crisis is not just a crisis in the US.
That's good. Okay.
I read in your book that you characterized Vladimir Putin's moves against the oligarchs as mostly symbolic, and that it's just basically the same thing under Yeltsin. In light of the recent Western responses to Russia's applications to join WTO and all those other organizations, what do you think will Russia's new course be after these responses?
Last one.
Okay. It would appear that the media is controlled by the right. How and can dissent be brought to the forefront?
Okay, one more. Oh, now I'll just take them all. I mean, I probably won't answer any of them, but...
Okay. I've been reading a lot lately about how after peak oil and the end of basically free energy, the carrying capacity of this planet has been estimated at about 2 billion people. And I'm just wondering if maybe having empathy and trying to exist in a cooperative society is maybe against our best interest, and possibly the right is on the right track and we should pay attention to the end of Dr. Strangelove.
Very good, eh?
I'm not sure. You guys seem to understand that. I didn't.
Very briefly, you touched on points about the Great Depression. My pet theory of why movements worked was the prospect of revolution, that Bolshevism scared the bejesus out of the ruling class and allowed a little more freedom for the polity and for pushing for progressive reform. Now, the question is very simple. What do the progressive social movements have to do at this time to scare the bejesus out of the ruling class so that they'll relax their grip on the polity a bit and allow for progressive reforms?
Tough crowd. I'm going to flunk those evaluation forms. Those are good questions. Thank you.
Got one more here.
One more. Okay.
Yes. 3 sentences, it's pretty hard, but one, would you mind asking the audience how many people are aware of the North American Union that's being planned right now by the Security and Prosperity Partnership?
I bet you a lot of them know. How many of you know about the SPP?
The North American Union and exactly what that strategic plan is all about. Anyhow, my second question is,
How come the media is not involved in this? How come this isn't part of discussions that are going on right now with our current election? Why is it being hidden so much? And what do you plan on doing about it? What do you plan on doing about it?
What do I plan
Could
on
you
doing
write a
about it?
book about it? It'd be a bestseller. There's a lot of people waiting to find out the truth about this.
Okay, I will. Awesome. Okay. Okay. You know, the Security and Prosperity Partnership, I think people kind of know what it is. It's NAFTA plus Homeland Security. NAFTA administered by Stockwell Day, kind of. That should scare the bejesus out of you. In Montebello, Quebec, at the SPP summit a little more than a year ago, it was really interesting because there was suddenly a little bit of media attention about the SPP just because they were having a summit. And in the early stages of the SPP, there clearly was a strategy like not to have a focal point for it. I think the understanding was that this thing of having really high-profile meetings, like the Free Trade Area of the Americas meeting in Quebec City, where there were 34 heads of state, you know, actually it becomes like this teaching moment where everyone's like, well, what the hell are these people talking about? And we learn about these deals, and there's a focal point for people to organize, and that really has backfired. So, you know, in the early stages of the SPP, there were very low-profile meetings, not leadership-level meetings, but really bureaucrats sort of hashing it out. The Montebello meeting was the first time in Canada where there was real attention, like just on the level of what is this thing. And the response was nothing, nothing, nothing. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. It's really nothing. And a lot of the coverage of the SPP was just denial and playing down the significance of it. And I was really struck just because I'm kind of fascinated by regression, that all of the examples that the Tories trotted out to explain how the SPP would be used involved children. It was like, we'll keep out, the reason why we need the SPP is so that we can keep dangerous toys out from China. We need to standardize the labeling for baby food. And there's a jelly bean manufacturer in Halifax who can't export their jelly beans. Those were the three main examples that we heard about. They were all sort of like, don't worry, kiddies, this is nothing. But what was interesting was that in the final press conference that they had about the SPP, they said, you know, we haven't made any progress, you know, in these talks. We're not integrating. All we've decided is that if there is a disaster, like a natural disaster or some sort of a cross-border pandemic or something like the cross-border blackout that hit the Great Lakes region, then we will cooperate militarily. And you know, it was really striking to me because I was about to publish this book, and you know, they were essentially saying, don't worry, we're not doing this unless there's a disaster, in which case there will be American soldiers in Canada, and you know, we'll be integrating. So they've kind of signaled this, that will be the next kind of leap forward. You know, in terms of the fear of the Soviet Union, you know, and that being, you know, I certainly, you know, write about this in the book and quote you know, a historian talking about the conditions that created the Marshall Plan in Germany. She was saying, well, you know, people kept saying that Iraq was going to get a Marshall Plan, but of course Iraq didn't get a Marshall Plan. Iraq just got looted, right? But everyone was using this phrase, a Marshall Plan, and what she was saying, her name's Carolyn Eisenman, she wrote a really great history of the Marshall Plan. She was saying, well, the reason why Germany got a Marshall Plan is because the Soviet Union was a loaded gun to America's head and to Western Europe's head. So, you know, there was a competition of ideologies and a feeling that if you didn't sort of sweeten the pot of capitalism, you know, throw in, you know, healthcare, welfare, make it less brutal, then people will go commie, right? So we don't have that kind of leverage now, certainly, and I think that so much of the kind of gloves off phase of capitalism that we are in is really about this sort of like, I call it the boorish stage of capitalism, whereas before it was in its seductive phase, like because there were other suitors, so we got flowers and chocolates, but then it was like, oh, the Berlin Wall collapsed, and then it was like, what are you going to do, leave me, I I want those chocolates back. I don't know how to predict, what's going to happen with this escalating tension with Russia. But I really am struck by the fact that I think we're seeing this tendency, a clear trend globally towards what I think is best described as authoritarian capitalism, or a phrase I heard today, corporate communism. That's what they have in China. That's what Putin has sort of solidified in Russia, and that's what the United States is looking more like too, certainly if Chairman Paulson gets his way. So it feels kind of strange, like this, communism for corporations, otherwise known as fascism, I think someone called out, and these sort of warring mega powers, maybe not superpowers. I do think that we can identify these clear trends, that it certainly challenges the claim that we were sold about capitalism and freedom going hand in hand. This is a very clear alternate trend that we really need to contend with. There was a question about Galveston, and I absolutely think that we're seeing the lessons of Katrina. Well, the lessons of Katrina was, boy, it's really bad when lots of journalists show up and do their job, right? I mean, one of the most shocking things about Katrina were all these like CNN reporters actually talking to people. I'm just used to CNN reporters just interviewing each other, right? I mean, that's what we count on CNN for, right? There are no people. But suddenly, there's Anderson Cooper just talking to people, right? And they have all these interesting things to say. And yeah, there was a complete media blackout. It's been incredibly difficult to get information out of the hurricane zone. We know that there have been all kinds of FEMA failures and the rest of it. I mean, they couldn't even get water at a certain point to their own first responders. So I think we're going to get, the stories will trickle out after the fact, but without that the impact that they would have if there had been cameras in the disaster zone. There was a question about the intertwined nature of the global economy. I think in the Great Depression it was a global depression, and it was actually a very globalized period for the markets that then shut down and have re-globalized, but because of technology and because of these complex financial instruments and currency trading and the rest of it, we are all certainly much more interdependent, and also the financial institutions are so so diverse that you have a company like AIG, and the reason, the rationale for why it was too big to fail was not its size. It was really, it's a combination of its size and the fact that it really isn't clear what AIG is, right? I mean, they are an insurance company, they are a bank, they have their hands in the mortgage market. They're all, and so the domino effect is not just in one industry; it's across the board. In terms of, there are a couple of questions about media and the failure of our media in Canada to cover these issues. I mean, in some ways, and the CBC, which is, I mean, one of the things that's really happened with the cuts to the arts, that at least some people, and the CBC, is that there's an unwillingness even to talk about it publicly, because this government is so intensely vindictive and is being so political about it. So it's frustrating to me that we don't hear more from people at the CBC talking about how they're being affected by the Tories, because they're afraid of retaliation, right? And we got a tiny little taste of that in my family recently. I mentioned the film that we made in Argentina, and some of you probably followed this story where Palm Arts, a program, an arts promotion program, was just slashed overnight by the Tories. It's a great program that allows writers and filmmakers to go to international festivals if they have an international publisher for a book and it's a small press and they can't afford to bring them to do publicity, then essentially the Canadian government partners with their publisher or their film distribution company so that they can go over and do the promotion. So my partner, Avi Lewis, got one of these grants. He didn't apply for it. The film festival in Australia that invited us to show the take, they use these, these small festivals use these programs because that's a way to get travel costs covered. So they're the ones who applied for it. And Avi went to Australia. We got Australian distribution for the take. And what that meant was that the NFB, which funded the film, was able to recoup their money. So like none of the money went to us. It's actually a very good model. But there was a Tory investigation into this program, and they came up with 3 examples of why it needed to be cut. And one of them was Gwyn Dyer going to Cuba. Another one was Avi Lewis, who was described as a general radical. Avi felt terrible about this, of course, because he was used to rationalize cutting a very good program. But he also wanted to apologize to general radicals everywhere, because he really doesn't feel that he's in your league. But what was interesting about the way they used Avi's name was just how intensely political it was. They didn't talk about the movie. It was just him. Right? And more than that, they said, Avi Lewis, a general radical who is working at Al Jazeera, right? An Arab network. Now, never mind that Avi's been at Al Jazeera for less than a year, and this happened in 2004. Maybe there was like a political pre-crimes unit. Like they should have known that there were going to be cutbacks at the CBC, and Avi would go to Al Jazeera and not given him that grant. But this is kind of McCarthy-era blacklisting, really. I mean, I'm surprised that there isn't more of an outcry about it. And this comes to the question about messaging. That message was so intensely managed, right? Media elite getting these grants, and it was used to shut down a program which overwhelmingly goes to support small publishers. And there was not very much outcry about that, although I'm really pleased that the arts community is organizing, and really organizing at the grassroots, not leaving it to arts bureaucrats and associations to fight this battle, but trying to take the battle to the public. There's a great campaign, there's a website called the Department of Culture that is focusing on the elections, zeroing in on vulnerable Tories, and just trying to unseat vulnerable Tories. They've got a very straightforward campaign. I think it's great. There's another campaign I wanted to mention called Vote Pair, which is a new website that's been launched to help people who are interested in strategic voting. Same idea, unseat the Tories. I know this is an issue in at least one riding in Regina. And basically, the problem with strategic voting is that too many people just interpret it as vote Liberal. Right? And they look at the big picture, get scared by the Tories, vote Liberal. And that's why Jack Layton always, although this time he doesn't seem to be doing it, campaigns against the Liberals. But the reason why this happens is because we haven't up till now had very good polling information broken down riding by riding, right? The parties have it, but we don't have it, right? So we look at the national level and we just say, okay, well, voting strategically means voting Liberal, and then you end up wiping out the NDP and the Greens, and this is a really bad election to do that, because we need progressive voices in Ottawa. So what this website allows you to do is go onto the website, type in where you live, and they have access, and I've met with the people who designed this website. Basically, what it's giving the public is access to the same polling data that the parties have, okay? It's called votepair.ca, P-A-I-R. So you can go to your riding and find out who has the best chance of beating the Tories in that riding. And then if it's like, oh, damn, I can't vote Liberal, then you can, it also has this vote swap mechanism where you can find somebody else who will agree to vote for the Greens or the NDP if you vote Liberal. So it's quite a nice thing, right? Anyway, I like the idea of sort of using this moment to embrace strategy, strategy and cooperation to resist this sort of doctrine of the strong leader, And I think we need to get out there and sort of debunk this message that strong leaders, I'm really sorry.
To make a comment about a local organizing campaign that's happening.
Okay, I'll let you go. Okay, well then I'm going to end there. We're going to hear something about local organizing. The film that we're going to show here, this was a viral film that was produced to go with the book by Alfonso Cuarón, who's a wonderful Mexican director who made Children of Men and Y Tu Mama Tambien. Some of you may have watched it online, but it's really nice to see it on the big screen. And we're actually expanding this into a full-length feature, not with Alfonso, with another director. It's only 6 minutes, not 11 minutes as advertised. So that just gives me enough chance to just settle in with the books, and I'll be out there. But in terms of the media, I don't know what to tell you. It's a bad scene. I came back to Canada after a couple weeks away. I picked up the National Post, and I'm sorry, I had to. I wanted to know how they were covering the financial crisis because, I have this sort of, vindictive streak. It's interesting to me, the publication that's been championing deregulated capitalism, how will they respond? How did they respond? By giving a full page to none other than convicted fraudster Conrad Black to explain to all of us how to fix the corrupt financial system. So, things are good, obviously. No, this is why it's so important that you came here tonight. This is an event put on by a fantastic alternative magazine that is expanding, that is becoming increasingly ambitious. These sorts of voices are crucial in this moment. So thank you for coming. Please subscribe to Briarpatch if you don't already, and support alternative media in whatever way you can, because, it's dire out there. All right, thank you. It's been fun. Thank you, everyone. We're just going to hear, if you guys could just listen up for an announcement, and then we're going to watch the film.
Folks, if you're interested in Saskatoon, we are launching a propaganda and website campaign called Not My Prime Minister. And within the next couple of days, we will have posters available for download that outline the history of the Harper government over the last 2 years to remind people what kind of policies they've been enacting. And so there will be more and more posters. It's something that's participatory, so if you have ideas, please submit them, but we want to get it up and running. There'll be PDFs to download. You can print them off and just plaster the city with them. So, thanks. NotMyPrimeMinister.ca.
Just as a really quick reminder to everybody, if you could fill out the short survey just out in the lobby, that would be greatly appreciated. And by doing so, you are entered to win an autographed copy of the Shock Doctrine and a Briarpatch t-shirt. So don't forget to do that.
As loud as it goes. Electroshock, the minds of dictations are being wiped clean, giving them a fresh start. On this blank slate, decisions that imprint a new, healthy personality.
Remaking people, shocking them into obedience. This is a story about that powerful idea. In the 1950s, it caught the attention of the CIA. The agency funded a series of experiments. Out of them was produced a secret handbook on how to break down prisoners. The key was using shock to reduce adults to a childlike state.
It's a fundamental hypothesis of this handbook that these techniques are in essence methods of inducing regression of the personality. There is an interval, which may be extremely brief, of suspended animation, a kind of psychological shock or paralysis. Experienced interrogators recognize this effect when it appears, and know that at this moment the source is far more open to suggestion, far likelier to comply than he was just before he experienced the shock.
But these techniques don't only work on individuals. They can work on whole societies. A collective trauma, a war, a coup, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack puts us all into a state of shock. And in the aftermath, like the prisoner in the interrogation chamber, we too become childlike, more inclined to follow leaders who claim to protect us. One person who understood this phenomenon early on was the most famous economist of our era, Milton Friedman. Friedman believed in a radical vision of society in which profit and the market drive every aspect of life, from schools to healthcare, even the army. He called for abolishing all trade protections, deregulating all prices, and eviscerating government services. These ideas have always been tremendously unpopular, and understandably so. They cause waves of unemployment, send prices soaring, and make life more precarious for millions. Unable to advance their agenda democratically, Friedman and his disciples were drawn to the power of shock.
The subject should be rudely awakened and immediately blindfolded and handcuffed. When arrested at this time, most subjects experience intense feelings of shock, insecurity, and psychological stress. The idea is to prevent the subject from relaxing and recovering from shock.
Friedman understood that just as prisoners are softened up for interrogation by the shock of their capture, massive disasters could serve to soften us up for his radical free market crusade. He advised politicians that immediately after a crisis, they should push through all the painful policies at once before people could regain their footing. He called this method economic shock treatment. I call it the shock doctrine. Take a second look at the iconic events of our era, and behind many, you will find its logic at work. This is the secret history of the free market. It wasn't born in freedom and democracy. It was born in shock.
Let's just...
Isolation, both physical and psychological, must be maintained from the moment of apprehension. The capacity for resistance is diminished by disorientation. Prisoners should maintain silence at all times. They should never be allowed to speak to each other.
There's one other thing I've learned from my study of states of shock. Shock wears off. It is by definition a temporary state. And the best way to stay oriented, to resist shock, is to know what is happening to you and why.
Is this still on? Dagan, is this still on? Can you bring that up? Another short announcement about the election in Saskatchewan, the federal election, if you're interested. People are talking about designing a strategy that doesn't lead to a sweep of the Conservatives. And it's starting to look something like this, as well as going to that website that was mentioned and designing your own in your riding, which I think people should do intelligently. Some of us are saying there are some people we want as voices from here, and one is David Orchard and another is Nettie Wiebe. And they are winnable seats. So people in those ridings who have other inclinations are beginning to trade their votes, which means we're starting to think about our collective effect. For example, if we want Elizabeth May in the next Parliament, those Greens who will vote NDP in ridings to elect progressive people like Nettie will be asking NDP people to put pressure on Jack Layton to pull back the NDP so that Elizabeth May can in fact defeat McKay and the Afghan policy in Cape Breton. And we can do this in Canada if we think clearly and communicate clearly. Don Mitchell is another possibility. It's a slightly more complicated situation, as you know. So I'm inviting you in the next 3 weeks to look closely at your riding and to not let naive partisanship get in the way of wise voting, so we don't have a majority or a large minority government with minority support after October 14th. So we can do this if we look at our ridings closely and trade our votes with the goals of progressive NDP and Liberal, Elizabeth May in Parliament, raise the Green vote where you can, where it doesn't in fact undermine a positive alternative to Harper. So I just invite you to do something in the next 2 weeks.